Hello ECS140A, my name is Martin Velez and I am making another video to help you get started on homework 3. So the purpose of this programming assignment is for you to gain some experience with object-oriented programming in Java, and in particular with the ideas of inheritance, dynamic binding, and overriding and overloading of methods. So this assignment is divided into 6 parts. In part 1, we're going to ask you to define some classes. That should be pretty easy. In part 2, we're going to ask you to define some specific methods for some of those classes. And in part 3, we're going to ask you to define additional methods for the class sequence, which is kind of like a list. And some of these methods might be hard, some of them might be easy. In part 4, we're going to ask you to define an iterator over a sequence, a class iterator. And if you're familiar with iterators, this is probably going to be a good exercise for you to actually implement one. If you're not familiar, then what a better way to become familiar with them. In part 5, we're going to ask you to define a two-dimensional sequence, or in other words, a matrix. And in part 6, we're going to ask you to define and implement a map. If you're not familiar with what a map is, read the homework description in the homework PDF, and that provides a good description of what a map is. Now, to get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to SmartSite. So where's SmartSite? Here it is. And I am going to download homework 3-given zip. And then I'm using Kotlin as my development environment, and I am going to drag and drop the zip file into my files. So let's do that. Where is Kotlin? Okay. Okay, so now I have a folder called homework 3. If I open it up, you'll see the 6 parts. Okay, so in part 1, like I said, it should be pretty easy. We're asking you to define 4 classes. Element, which should be an abstract class, and mychar, myInteger, and sequence, which should extend or implement that class. Now, let me show you what that means. So Professor Su has been kind enough to provide you with some code already. So here's what I would do. I would open part 1. I would create a file. So let's call this element.java. Okay. And I'm going to create another file. Let's call this mychar.java. And like I said, Professor Su has been kind enough to provide you with some code already. So let's go ahead and just start typing what he has given you. So I'm defining a constructor right now. I am defining a getter. So public get, public char get, and notice that these are incomplete methods. So this is just for demonstration. And then public void set char and some value. So this is what Professor Su has given you already. You can do the same for myInteger.java. So let's see, myInteger.java. Okay, and you also need sequence.java. Now let's move on to part 2. So in part 2, we're going to ask you to define a print member method for each class, so that you can actually print the integer, print the character, or print a sequence. And we're going to ask you to define 5 methods for the sequence class: first, rest, length, add, and delete. Okay, so take a look at the homework PDF to find out what these methods are supposed to do. Now, for the previous homework, a lot of you had questions about how do you develop and test for the homework, right? So if you take a look at part 2, there are 3 files in there already. And if you take a look at part 3, there are also 3 files. So these files, this is a make file, Let me close these. And this is the correct output of what your test program should. This is the correct output, and this is the test program. So the test program will use the classes you have defined in part 1 and you have refined in part 2. So it will use the classes you have defined and instantiate them, as here like in line 17 where it says my char c, my integer I, and then it's going to call the methods that you defined, that you implemented for those classes. So how do you do that? Well, you can do it the simple way, which is just calling make2. For each part you can just say make t2 or make t3 or make t4 and so on. Now, in the previous homework, a lot of you found this easy and you can just run the script which builds, runs, and tests for you. But sometimes you run into trouble and you want to debug more. So if you want to do that, you can also run these commands, which are found in the make file. You can build the test program. You can then run the test program, and then you can call diff. You can do that. But usually, if you're debugging, you probably only care about the first 2 commands. Okay. So again, in part 1 there are no test scripts, and in parts 2 through part 6 there is a test program, and your job is to simply define the classes. So the tester program will be instantiating those classes and calling the methods that you define. Okay. So now one final note: you cannot use any other libraries or pre-existing classes for implementing classes like sequence and map. In other words, implement everything from scratch. You are allowed to use the primitives char and primitives int, but that's it. And okay, so what I recommend is that you read the homework PDF carefully. It is multiple pages long. If you need help or need clarification, ask questions in Piazza. As you can see, people are always willing to help. And also ask questions during discussion. That's probably a good place to ask questions. And also office hours. We're always, during office hours is probably also a good place. Now, start early. Please start early. That way, if you have questions, you can ask them with enough time and people can get back to you with enough time. Okay? So, good luck and talk to you later.